4 of the top 10 ranked teams in the AP Top 25 lost their games this week. So we're going to talk about that in today's episode of College Football with John. Before we get into talking about the matchups for this past week, I just did want to mention that this is my first video and I do plan on mainly covering college football on this channel. I will probably cover some NFL news also in the channel, especially toward the end of the college football season. So be sure to stay tuned to the channel for that if you are an NFL fan as well. But let's get into the content for this week. The first loss for this past week was on Saturday, and it was the big noon game on Fox, which was probably one of the biggest games for the week, and that was the Texas and Ohio State game. And Texas lost the game 14-7. It was only a one-score game that Texas lost by, but I honestly thought that Texas was going to win this game, but unfortunately they did not. My reasons for saying that I thought Texas was going to win was because they did have a proven quarterback in Arch Manning, and Ohio State does have a new starting quarterback this season in Julian Sayans, so I thought that Texas was going to win this game. I had a feeling that the score was going to be pretty low and fairly close, but I did think that Texas was going to win. But Ohio State came out of winning the college football national championship last season and losing a lot of their talent to the NFL, including Will Howard going to play for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So with that, maybe now the Steelers will do better this year if Will Howard is their starting quarterback after he comes off the injured list. Now, Ohio State also lost their defensive coordinator, Jim Knowles, who transferred to Penn State, but they hired Matt Patricia to replace Jim Knowles, and Matt Patricia has worked with several teams in the NFL. And Ohio State does have a pretty easy schedule coming up this season. Their next two games are against an FCS team and a group of 5 team. And then their most difficult games will probably be against Illinois, Penn State, and Michigan. Now, their game against Washington, which is a road game, may be a little bit difficult for them because it is 3 time zones away. And I have heard some people say that they think that might possibly be a loss for Ohio State, but I don't quite buy that. I think that they're going to overcome that time travel, so I think they're going to win that game against Washington. But yeah, their toughest games are going to be definitely against, I think Penn State and Michigan are going to be the 2 toughest games for them. I think that they'll still probably win against Illinois. Now, Texas lost to Ohio State for the second time this year after being defeated in the college football playoff semifinal game of last season. Now, Texas's next 3 games are non-conference group of 5 opponents, so they should be able to win those fairly easily. And they do have a bit of a tough schedule this year, but their toughest games to follow are against Florida, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Texas A&M. As a result of Texas losing this game to Ohio State, that did change the top 25 rankings for week 2, and Ohio State went to number 1, and Texas fell to number 7 as a result of that loss this past week. The next loss on the top 10 rankings would have been number 4 Clemson against number 9 LSU, and number 4 Clemson lost 17 to 10 to LSU, which again, that's another one score game. They were only a touchdown apart. And now I think that both teams are really good this season, but LSU definitely played better. LSU won their first game of the season, which broke a 5-year streak where they have lost their first game of the season. I remember last season they lost to USC as their first regular season game. Now, LSU does have a pretty tough schedule ahead of them where they play Florida, which is currently ranked number 13, and that game will be in 2 weeks. Then they will also face Ole Miss, South Carolina, Texas A&M, Alabama, and Oklahoma later in the season. And all of those teams are ranked in the AP top 25. So I think this might be a tough season for LSU. However, they can still do pretty good, and I know there are people that are saying that they believe that LSU might be able to make it into the playoffs this season. I don't quite buy that yet, but we'll just have to wait and see how well they do against these other teams. Now, Clemson just came out of making the college football playoff last season where they lost to Texas in the first round of the playoff. And Clemson, on the other hand, does have a pretty easy schedule this season. And their toughest games are going to be against Georgia Tech, SMU, South Carolina, and maybe Florida State, depending on how well they do this season. And I will talk more about Florida State here in a few moments. The Clemson loss caused Clemson to fall from number 4 to number 8 in the AP Top 25 in week 2, and LSU moved up from number 9 to number 3 in the AP Top 25. The next loss was number 6 Notre Dame to number 10 Miami Hurricanes. Now, Notre Dame lost only by 3 points. They lost 27 to 24 to Miami. And looking at that game, Miami is making a comeback after missing the college football playoff last season and losing to Ohio State in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. Now, they're still under head coach Mario Cristobal, and they picked up Carson Beck out of the transfer portal as their starting quarterback. Now, Carson Beck played for Georgia last season until he was injured in the SEC championship game. But he did go into the transfer portal after that injury, and he was picked up by the Miami Hurricanes. Now, Miami does have a pretty easy schedule this year, with their toughest games being against Florida and SMU. Miami also plays Florida State this season, which can also be a tough matchup. Again, that's going to depend on how well Florida State does play this season. Now, Notre Dame suffered their first loss of this season after losing to Ohio State in the national championship game last season. And they also lost several players and their defensive coordinator to the NFL. Now, Notre Dame does have a bye week in week 2, so they will have time to recover from that first loss of the season. And I think that they should do pretty well this season, and I think they'll make the playoffs again this year. Their toughest games are probably going to be against Texas A&M, Boise State, and USC. With Notre Dame's loss, they fell from number 6 to number 9 in the AP Top 40, and Miami Hurricanes moved from number 10 up to number 5 in the rankings. Now to the most disappointing loss and that I think, and that was number 8 Alabama losing to an unranked team, Florida State, and they lost 31-17. So that was a pretty big loss for Alabama. Now, Alabama just hired Kalen DeBoer last season to be their head coach after Nick Saban retired. And last season was a disappointment for Alabama, considering that they lost 3 games last season. Now, Florida State won this game this past Saturday after being one of the worst FBS teams last season, and their record was 2-10. So they were pretty bad last season, but the season before they just missed making the playoffs. So they might actually have a chance this year with a fairly easy schedule, and their toughest opponents are going to be the Miami Hurricanes, Clemson, and Florida. Those will probably be their toughest games. Now, Alabama missed the playoff last season by losing to Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and Oklahoma in the regular season, and then they also lost to Michigan in the ReliaQuest Bowl during the bowl game season. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens to Alabama this season. Now, taking a closer look at Alabama's upcoming season, I think that they do have a fairly easy schedule. I don't know. It might be difficult for Alabama. I don't think they're going to make the playoffs again this season. I think that they're probably going to repeat similar to what they did last year. They'll probably end up being 9-3 or 8-4 and maybe missing the college football playoffs. Although they can probably still make it with a 9-3 record. But next week, in week 2, they do play UL Monroe, which that should be an easy game. That's a non-conference game. That should be an easy win for Alabama. And then after that, they play Wisconsin. That's a home game. They should be able to beat Wisconsin without a problem. Now, their toughest game is probably going to be on the road at Georgia. Now, the last couple years, Alabama has beat Georgia, so it's hard to tell how well they're going to do in that game. And then after that, they play Vanderbilt at home, which they lost to last season, so that'll be interesting to see if they can beat Vanderbilt this season. And then they play at Missouri, and then they play Tennessee at home, which is another ranked team. That could be a tough matchup. And then they play at South Carolina, which is another ranked team. Then they play LSU at home, and they play Oklahoma at home, which is another team that they lost to last season. So that'll be interesting to see what happens there. And then after that, they have another non-conference game to EIU, which I'm not even sure what that is. Oh, Eastern Illinois is what EIU is. And then at the end of the season, they play Auburn, which I think they should be able to win against Auburn. So I'm going to say they're definitely going to win against UL Monroe. If they lose to that team, there's something seriously wrong with Alabama. They should be able to beat Wisconsin. I don't know what to predict about Georgia. They should be able to beat Vanderbilt. They should be able to beat Missouri. They should be able to beat Tennessee, although they are ranked number 23. Let me see. Alabama's loss this week caused them to fall down to number 21. So actually, they're ranked ahead of Tennessee right now. But that could be a tough matchup. But I think Alabama could win against Tennessee. And then South Carolina, that could be a tough game. LSU's probably going to be a tough game. Oklahoma, I don't know. That it's hard to tell. And in Eastern Illinois, that's got to be a win for Alabama. And I think they can beat Auburn. So their season's going to be in question this season, and how well they do. And I know that this might upset some Alabama fans out there, but I don't think that a whole bunch of losses, as long as Alabama still makes a bowl game, I think Kalen DeBoer might still be safe, although he might be on the hot seat according to some Alabama fans because of how poorly the team did last season compared to how they've done in previous seasons. But you have to remember, this is Kalen DeBoer, who is their head coach now. This is not Nick Saban. Nick Saban is retired now. So Kalen DeBoer basically has to start the team over from Nick Saban and try to improve over the next coming weeks. So we'll see what happens with Alabama. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple weeks. Other than those four teams that lost, there was only one other loss in the AP Top 25 this week, and that was Boise State, and they lost to South Florida 34-7, which that was a disappointment for Boise State to lose by that much. Last season, they were in the college football playoffs, and they made it to they actually won the Mountain West Championship game, and they were actually, I believe, the number 4 seed in the college football playoffs last season. So they got a bye week, so they didn't play in the first round. But then they lost to Penn State in the quarterfinals. So it's going to be interesting to see how well Boise State does this coming season. Now, looking at some of the other matchups here, number 2 Penn State this past week, they won to Nevada. They won 46-11. Now, I was at that game, and I thought Penn State did pretty well. I think they could have done a little bit better. I thought that they would have beaten Nevada by at least 50 points. But a win of 46-11 is not a disappointment for Penn State. Now, this coming week, week 2, Penn State did not move in the AP Top 25. They're still ranked number 2. And they play Florida International this coming week, which that should be an easy win for Penn State. And then number 5, Georgia, they won 45-7, beating Marshall. And they moved up to number 4 in the AP Top 25. And then number 7, Oregon beat Montana State 59-13, and they moved up one spot to number 6. And then Arizona State, which was ranked number 11, played Northern Arizona, and they won 38-19. Arizona State won 38-19. And they actually moved down to number 12. And then number 12, Illinois, moved up to number 11 this week from week 0 to week 2. The preseason, Illinois was ranked number 12, and they moved up to number 11 in week 2. And they won 52-3 against Western Illinois. And then number 13, South Carolina, they won 24-11, defeating Virginia Tech. And they actually moved up to number 10, which I find very odd that they moved up that many spaces after only winning by, 13 points to Virginia Tech. And there were other teams that had much better victories than they did. So, I don't know. That's kind of weird. Number 14, Michigan won 34-17, defeating New Mexico. And they moved down a spot to number 15 in week 2. Number 15, Florida, they won 55-0 against Long Island University, which I'd never heard of Long Island University until I saw that matchup in the schedule. And Florida moved up 2 spots, which I can see moving up 4 spots after completely blowing out Long Island. And then number 16, SMU, they won 42-13 against East Texas A&M, and they moved down 1 spot to number 17 in week 2. Number 17, Kansas State, they won in week 1 to North Dakota, and they only won by 3 points. Their final score was 38-35. And they lost to Iowa State in week 0 in the Aer Lingus game over in England. And they lost by only a field goal. 24-21 was the score of that game. And Kansas State completely fell out of the top 25. Number 18, Oklahoma, they won against Illinois State 35-3, and they actually stayed the same at number 18. Number 19, Texas A&M, won 42-24 against UTSA, and they stayed at number 19. Number 20, Indiana, they won 24-14, beating Old Dominion. And they actually moved down 3 spots, which I think was kind of odd for them to fall down 3 spots to number 23. And now this coming week, they will be playing Kennesaw State. And then after that, they play another easy team, and then they get into their regular conference schedule. Now, Indiana made the playoffs last year for the first time in a long time, and they actually had a record-breaking season last year in having a final record of 11-1 in the regular season, which was definitely a first in the history of the Indiana football program. And their coach, Curt Cignetti, is a phenomenal coach, and I think that they're still going to do well again this season. They may miss the playoffs this season, I don't know, but I think that their toughest games are going to be, they play Oregon and they play Penn State, and they also play Illinois, and Illinois is the first big matchup that they have, and that could be a tough game for Indiana. But I think that they should be able to have a 10-2 or 9-3 record at the end of this season without any problems. Like I said, their toughest opponents other than Illinois are going to be Oregon and Penn State, and I think they're going to lose definitely to Oregon, and I think they're definitely going to lose to Penn State. So it's going to be interesting to see how well Indiana does this season. I know I've become a fan of that team after seeing how well Curt Cignetti did last year. And then number number 21 Ole Miss, they won 63-7, defeating Georgia State, and they moved up one to number 20 in week 2. Number 22 Iowa State, they defeated South Dakota 55-7, and they actually moved up to number 16 in week 2 after defeating Kansas State in week 0 and South Dakota in week 1. And then number 23 Texas Tech, they moved down to number 24. They won 67-7 against Arkansas Pine Bluff, which I find that weird that they fell down a spot after a big win like that, but I don't know. And then number 24 Tennessee, they beat Syracuse 45-26, and they moved up 2 spots to number 22. And then number 25 Boise State, they lost to South Florida, as I mentioned earlier, and Boise State completely fell out of the top 25, and Utah made it into the top 25 at number 25. And the other team that fell out was Kansas State, and their fallout caused Florida State to move into the AP top 25, and Florida State is at number 14, which I found that to be very odd for them to go from being out of the top 25 all the way up to number 14 for week 2. So it's going to be interesting to see how well Florida does this season. And then I did want to talk about a few other games that were notables. I did watch a couple of these games, bits and pieces of them. I did not watch the full games, but Missouri Tigers, they won 61-6, defeating Central Arkansas. Now, I think Missouri did pretty well. They have a really good quarterback. Their quarterback is Bo Pribula, which was the backup quarterback at Penn State last season. So he did pretty well in that game. I didn't get to watch that game because I don't get the channel that game was on, but I was able to listen to it on Sirius XM a little bit, and from what I heard, they were doing pretty well from what I listened to. But a 61-6 victory over Central Arkansas, that is pretty darn good. And then Nebraska, they beat Cincinnati 20-17. Now, there's different people saying that Nebraska could potentially be a college football playoff contender this season. I don't know if I buy that. It's possible that they could do well this season, but that was a very close win against Cincinnati, only a field goal difference, so that wasn't all that impressive to me. And I know Nebraska plays Penn State this year, and I don't think I think Penn State's going to defeat them. I don't think Nebraska's going to win that game. And then another game that I thought was really good was USC, and they beat Missouri State 73-13, and I think that was the highest score that any team got this week was USC, and I think USC actually might have a chance this season. They might actually do pretty well, and I would say they might be a dark horse for the college football playoffs this year because they're a pretty good team. So it's going to be interesting to see how well they do this season. They don't play Penn State this year. I know that. I think they play Ohio State. I'm not. Let me take a look at their schedule here. Okay, now looking at USC's schedule here, they do play Georgia Southern this coming week, and that should be an easy win for USC. Then they play at Purdue. That should be an easy win for USC. I don't think Purdue's going to do very well again this season, even though they do have a new head coach. I still don't think Purdue's going to do very well because they have a very difficult schedule this year. So I don't think Purdue's going to do very well. I look for them to be, I'd say 2-10. Uh, Worst case scenario, probably 2-10. Maybe 3-9. I don't know, but I don't think they're going to do that well this season. Probably better than last season because I think last season they were 1-11. So Purdue's probably going to be an easy win for USC. And then USC plays Michigan State at home. And then they travel to Illinois, which is a ranked team. So that could be a tough game for USC, but they could still probably win that game. And then they host Michigan. That is a toss up. I think that USC might lose that game. I don't know. They might lose to Michigan. And then they play at Notre Dame. Again, that's a tough matchup. I don't know how well that's going to fare because I know Notre Dame has defeated USC quite a bit over the last few years. And then USC plays at Nebraska. And then they host Northwestern, which that should be an easy win for USC. I don't think Northwestern is going to be very good this season either because they also have a pretty tough schedule ahead of them. And then USC will travel to, or they will actually, no, they will host Iowa. So that's a questionable game. Iowa does, it's hard to tell how well Iowa's going to do this year, but that could possibly be a win for USC. And then USC travels to Oregon. That's going to be a very tough game, I think, for USC traveling to Oregon. Now, it is in the same time zone, so they do have that, but they do have to travel to Oregon. So, and Oregon is another pretty good team, so it's going to be hard to tell. I think they're going to lose that game. USC. I think USC is going to lose that game. And then they host UCLA at the end of the season, and I think that should be a win for USC. It's going to be interesting to see how well UCLA does with their new quarterback who played for Tennessee last year. So that's going to be interesting. But I think USC will they'll probably do pretty well. They may not make the playoff, but I think that they'll still at least make a bowl game. They may end up with an 8-4 record. It it's hard to tell, but only time will tell. We'll see. And then another matchup I did want to talk about was the game on Monday night. And I did watch a lot. I did watch quite a bit of that game, and that was TCU defeating North Carolina, which North Carolina is, in case you don't know, North Carolina is being coached by Bill Belichick, who is the former coach of the New England Patriots. And Bill Belichick has so many Super Bowl wins because he was the head coach when Tom Brady played for New England. So I don't understand how he can do so poorly in his opening game at North Carolina. Now, granted, Bill Belichick has never coached college football before, so college football is different from the NFL, but not that much different. So I think that's kind of a shame for North Carolina that they lost to TCU. Now, TCU is not a bad team. They've had some pretty good seasons in the past. And they won 48-14 against North Carolina. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the coming weeks with North Carolina. In looking at North Carolina's schedule, I think they have a fairly easy season, so it's going to be interesting to see how well that they actually do after losing to TCU this past week. They do play Charlotte this coming week, and that's an away game for North Carolina, but it's still going to be in the state of North Carolina, just in a different town. And then they host Richmond the following week, which is an FCS team. That should be a win for North Carolina. I don't see why they would lose to Richmond. And then they travel to UCF in the next one. That should be a win, I think, for North Carolina. And then they do host Clemson. That's probably going to be a loss for North Carolina. I don't see how they're going to beat Clemson. And then they play at Cal, which Cal they should be able to win that game. And then they play Virginia at home. Again, that should be an easy win for North Carolina. It's hard to tell. They play at Syracuse. That's going to be interesting to see how well Syracuse does this season without Kyle McCord as their quarterback. But we'll see. It's hard to tell who's going to win that game. And then North Carolina they host Stanford. That should be an easy win for North Carolina. Then they travel to Wake Forest. Again, that should be a win for North Carolina. And then they host Duke. That could be a tough one. It's hard to tell how well that one will fare. And then they finish their season by playing at North Carolina, NC State. That's going to be interesting to see how well they do in that game. I think North Carolina should be able to beat NC State, but it's hard to tell. We'll just have to see how well North Carolina does here in this season. All right, I think that's going to wrap up this video. I do want to thank you so much for watching this video. And if you liked what you saw, please give the video a like down below and be sure to subscribe to the channel. And I will see you in the next video. You be blessed and stay safe. Bye for now.